Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us when these things will be, and what will be the sign of your coming, and of the end of the age." And Jesus answered, "See that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another, and many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And the gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, women who are pregnant, and for those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath. For there will be the great tribulation, such as there has never been from the beginning of the world until now. No and will never will be. And if those days had not been short, no human would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days have been cut short. Then if anyone says to you, "Look, here is the Christ," or "There he is," do not believe it. For false Christs and prophets will arise and perform signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So if someone says to you, "Look, he is in the wilderness," do not go out. If they say, "Look, he is in the inner rooms," do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, the vultures will gather. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from the end of the heavens to the other. From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branches become tender and put out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also when you see all these things, you know that it is near at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But concerning that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. For as with the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood there was eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark. And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and one left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one left. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not let his house be broken into. Therefore you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming in an hour you do not expect. For then is the faithful and wise servant, or who is the faithful and wise servant, whom his master has set over his household to give them food in proper time. Blessed is the servant whose master will find him doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if that wicked servant says to himself, "My master is delayed," and begins to beat his fellow servants and eat and drinks with drunkards, the master of the servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and an hour that he does not know, and will cut him into pieces and put him with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. I want to start tonight by giving you my intention for this series and my heart in wanting you to come to an understanding of what we just read. As we read this text, there are no doubt phrases and verses that you have heard before. You're familiar with them. If you have any kind of church experience whatsoever, you're familiar with these phrases and these verses. But I want to warn you that the interpretation and explanation that you will hear in this series will be very different from what your tradition may be. One of my favorite movies is The Princess Bride, written by William Goldman. In this movie, one of the characters, Vizzini, keeps using the word inconceivable. Something will happen, and he says, inconceivable! And he says it over and over and over and over and over again. After hearing this word multiple times, his hired sword, Inigo Montoya, you killed my father, prepare to die. He had had enough, and he uttered this popular line. You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means. Now I want to warn you that I have found in my months of studying this text that this is the case here. We're familiar with these words and these verses, and we often use them, but I don't think they mean what we think they mean. Now, I don't want to alarm you, and I don't want you to simply take my word for it. We've broken down this chapter into 10 lessons. One chapter, 10 sermons. My desire is to slowly walk you through the text using historical and exegetical resources in order for you to see it for yourself. Being convinced from sound logic and from Scripture. I desire for you to be convinced that my explanation is correct, not because I need you to agree with me. I'm not that petty, nor am I that insecure in what I believe, that I have to have you agree with me. No, what I want and what my heart desires is for you to understand what Scripture says, because I believe with all my heart that the benefits of this chapter will greatly influence your life. As Dr. James White is fond of saying, theology matters. Getting something wrong matters. And God has given us His Word in order that we may know what it says and have proper theology, and that includes eschatology. Eschatology is the study of end things. It is one of the areas that we don't really like to deal with. Some people might say, well, there's so much confusion, I'll just let the Lord take care of it. Or someone may say, I don't really know where I stand, it'll all just pan out in the end. Well, it is certainly true that the Lord will take care of it. And it is certainly true that it will all pan out in the end. However, in the meantime, we are supposed to study God's Word and know what it says and know what it means. This book has not been given to us to be a mystery, but to reveal things. So I don't believe it's good enough for the Christian to just simply say, it'll all pan out in the end, I won't worry about it. I think that's being intellectually and spiritually lazy. God has given us His Word. Let's deal with it. I want us to be clear, by the grace of God and the illumination of the Holy Spirit, clear on what Matthew 24 teaches. Nothing that I'm going to teach is new. Nothing that I'm going to say is recent. It's not fresh. It's not cutting edge. It is as old as the church fathers themselves. In fact, it is much older than the tradition that many of us were taught, which is only about 150 years old, called dispensational premillennialism. You may not know that's what it has been called, but that's what it is. I pray that you'll make it a priority to be here during these 10 sessions, and that you will ask the Lord for wisdom and understanding as we work through Jesus' words. Tonight, we're going to look at verses 1 through 3. Let's reread these 3 verses. And then I've got 45 minutes, and I will use every second of it. Jesus left the temple and was going away when His disciples came to point out to Him the buildings of the temple. But He answered them, you see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. As He sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to Him privately, saying, tell us when these things will be, and what will be the sign of your coming at the end of the age. Now the truth is, in order to understand these first 3 verses, we actually need to go back into chapter 23. You do realize that when the gospel was written, they didn't write the verses and the chapters in. It went straight from the end of 23 right into 24. There was no break there. So we need to go back and actually understand what verses 37, 38, and 39 of Matthew 23 say. So let's read those. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it, how often I would have gathered your children together as a hen her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Here we see Jesus lamenting over Jerusalem's failure to properly respond to God. God has given them commands. The Lord has given them things that they were supposed to do. And instead of properly obeying, they killed and persecuted the prophets the Lord had sent, bringing upon themselves the blood of those they have killed. And now they are rejecting the great prophet. So they had rejected all the prophets God had sent in the Old Testament. They killed them. They persecuted them. Now the great prophet is here, and they're doing the very same thing, rejecting him. So Jesus comes to Jerusalem, and he's going to pass judgment on it. More specifically, judgment on Jerusalem's temple, which is the central place of Israel's worship. Notice what Jesus says in verse 38. See, your house. Notice he doesn't say God's house. He doesn't say the Lord's house. What does he say? Your house. Your house. He doesn't say it's my house, it's our house, it's the Lord's house. It's your house. Who is the you he's talking about? Those who have killed the prophets and are now rejecting me. This is your house. This language is appropriate considering what Jesus says right after that. See, your house is left desolate. This temple is not God's house anymore. His presence does not reside there, and it is left desolate and has no future purpose. Jesus was proclaiming a judgment on Israel and Jerusalem and the temple by saying, your house is left to you desolate. Why? Because you never did what you were supposed to do. And now I am here, and you're doing the same thing to me. This was a shocking statement by Jesus. We know this by the reaction of the disciples. This was a shocking statement. Jesus says, this temple, which Israel prided themselves in, he says, this temple, your house, is left to you desolate. Serves no purpose. Then, chapter 24, verse 1, our text for tonight. Jesus is leaving the temple, obviously not out of view of the temple. The disciples' statement was probably made as they're leaving the temple proper. They're exiting out the east gate. They can still see the temple. That's probably when this statement that they make is made. Now, the disciples would have been here for days, and they would have already been admiring these buildings. So it's not like they're just seeing these buildings all of a sudden and they're like, wow, look at them. They're great. They would have been admiring them for days. This statement is more than just these buildings are beautiful. They've already seen that. The wow of the beauty of the buildings were gone. So why do they make this statement? Why do they point out the building complex to Jesus? Well, Matthew has pieced this together for us. In light of the fact that Jesus says this temple is pointless, it's desolate, and it's not the Lord's house, the disciples then, this massive complex that was their central of worship, it was unfathomable to them that this place would be desolate. This is the central place of worship. How can it be desolate, Jesus? Look at this temple. Look at this complex. So they pointed out to him. But Jesus is steadfast, and his next statement in verse 2 is even more shocking. It's not just your house, and it's not just desolate. Then he says this. But he answered them, you see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. You want to know how desolate it is? It's going to be destroyed. Not one stone will be left on another. It is going to be completely wiped out. Why? Because it's not God's house anymore. His presence is not there. It is not God's house. It is your house. It is desolate, and it is going to be destroyed. Then Matthew records that Jesus is now seated at the Mount of Olives. So they've left the east gate, they've gone out of the east gate, and they've gone up to the Mount of Olives. No doubt now being able to see the temple complex from the Mount of Olives. And it says that Jesus is seated. Now, why does Matthew go out of his way to say that Jesus is sitting down? Because that was the posture of a teacher. Jesus would sit, and the disciples would sit underneath him as Jesus taught. And so as Jesus is sitting in the posture of a teacher, of a rabbi, of their Lord, they ask a question. Matthew records this question for us. Looking at the temple complex, looking down on it, they say, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming at the end of the age? Here is what they're saying. They're saying, Jesus, if this house is going to be left desolate and it's going to get destroyed, then tell us when this is going to happen. We want to know when this is going to happen. Now, we need to analyze this question just for a second, because the disciples had some things wrong in their understanding. According to Sam Storms and many others that I have read, the disciples evidently believed, as did most in that day and time, that the temple was as permanent as the world itself. If the temple was to be destroyed, it must mark the consummation of history as we know it. They believed the temple was permanent throughout human history, and if this temple falls, it is the end of the world. That's what they believed. You say, well, why did they believe that? I don't have time to go into all of it today, but here's the basic reason why they did not believe it, or why they misunderstood and thought that when the temple got destroyed, that means the end of the world. It's because they knew the Old Testament, they had read the Old Testament, and in Isaiah and Ezekiel and Haggai and others, there's this description of a temple that will last forever. A description of a temple that will be forever. And what they did is they misunderstood that temple was the future, as we'll talk about in just a minute. And they believed it was the rebuilt temple that occurred when they left Babylonian captivity, went back into Jerusalem, rebuilt their temple. They thought all of those promises, the ultimate fulfillment of all of those promises, was that second temple. And I'm here to let you know, it's not the ultimate fulfillment. They misunderstood the Old Testament and believed that when this temple fell, it must be the end of the world, because we know from the Old Testament it's going to last forever. Let me point out one to you. Turn to Haggai chapter 2. We talked in class today, in my Sunday school class, about how when you start having to flip through the minor prophets, you kind of get embarrassed because it takes you too long to get to them, and you're flipping through. So some of them are coming up with ways, like someone kind of hide their Bible and they flip through it. Some of them, Suzanne said, she just flips and acts like she's there. She's like, as she's still flipping, like she still hasn't found it. Some were like, I just take a long time, don't judge me. Haggai chapter 2, verse 9. Haggai was written when Darius was king, Israel was still in exile. Haggai's written. A lot of what Haggai says is about what's going to happen when they go back into Jerusalem. But then you have this statement in Haggai chapter 9, verse 2. The later glory of this house shall be greater than the former, says the Lord of hosts. And in this place I will give you peace, declares the Lord of hosts. So, you can understand what the disciples were thinking. They were thinking, well, this was written to exiled Jews. They would have read this and said, well, when we rebuild our temple, it's going to be beautiful and greater than the former temple, and it's going to be awesome. And if you go to, if we know from Ezekiel that it's going to last forever. So the temple we're going to build is going to be better than the first, and it's going to last forever. Here's the problem with that. those of you that are in Sunday school, when the temple was rebuilt, was it greater than Solomon's temple or less than Solomon's temple? It was way less than Solomon's temple. In fact, it says that the older men who had seen the first temple built and now saw the second temple built, it said that they cried aloud. Why? Because it was not like the first temple. Not in size, not in beauty, not in any way was the second temple as good as the first temple. So we have a problem here. Haggai chapter 2 verse 9 has not been fulfilled. If the second temple is just this verse, it has not been fulfilled. And the disciples thought it had been. So now when they look at this second temple, they think, this is forever. Ezekiel tells us it's forever. So this is just one instance. I don't have time to read literally 8 chapters of Ezekiel to you, because it's all right there in 8 chapters. But it talks about a temple that's greater than any temple that has ever been built, and this temple will be forever. And the disciples thought, as most did during that day, that was the second temple. Jesus, in the rest of Matthew 24, is going to correct their theology. He's going to tell them, you've interpreted it wrong. Let me help you. Let me help you out. Jesus does this by taking their question and breaking it into 2 questions. They said, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming? Because if the temple falls, then it's got to mean you're coming back. So, give us the signs. Jesus takes the question, he breaks it up into 2 questions. First question is in regards to the destruction of the temple. When will the temple fall? This is verse 4 through 35. The second question is, when is the coming of the end of the age? When as is the Lord coming back? That is in verses 36 through 51. So let me make something very clear to you. We just read the entire chapter, right? 24. Matthew 35 and back have nothing to do with the second coming of Christ. So all the language in verses 4 through 35 have nothing to do with the second coming of Christ. It has everything to do with the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Then verses 36 through 51 are all about the second coming of Christ. And they are radically different in their tone. One is signs. Here's the things to look for. Here's what's going to happen. Here's how you'll know it's coming. The other is, you don't know it's coming. There's nothing to look for, so be ready. One question in their mind, Jesus takes it and makes it 2 questions. So I'm letting you know how we're going to proceed from here on out. Now the title of this session tonight is, however, not that the temple must fall, but why the temple must fall. That's the question I want to answer tonight. Is not that the temple must fall. It is why the temple must fall. To answer this, we got to go back. Way, way back. To the beginning of creation. As I am explaining to you the main reason why the temple must fall, I'm going to be leaning heavily on G.K. Bill's book, The Temple and the Church's Mission. So you have one of 2 options. You can either listen really close for the next 30 minutes or you can read this 400-page book. It's up to you. I would suggest reading the 400-page book. But if you're not going to, then listen really close. It's going to be good. Just letting you know, these are not, some fresh idea I'm making up off the top of my head. I don't have time to go into everything, but I do want you to catch the big picture. When God created the world, He also created on earth the Garden of Eden. God took man and put man in the Garden of Eden. He put woman in the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden was a unique place where the presence of God dwelt upon the earth. With me so far? We all know that. In Genesis 3:8, The Hebrew word for God walking in the garden, you remember when it says that God would come and walk with Adam and Eve in the garden? The Hebrew word for walking in the garden is the exact same word for God's presence in the tabernacle of Moses. So the same word for the presence of God in the tabernacle of Moses is the same word for the presence of God walking with Adam and Eve in the garden. Now, we usually don't think of Eden in these terms, but it is right that this is the first dwelling place of the Lord upon the earth. The Garden of Eden is the first place where God manifests Himself upon the earth to people, just like He would do in Moses, the tent of meeting, the tabernacle. The Garden of Eden was a tabernacle or sanctuary where man would meet with God in the Garden of Eden. And we don't usually use it that way, but it's certainly that way. And what was the role of Adam in this sanctuary? He was to work it and keep it. Now it's interesting, those two words, every time they're put together in the Old Testament, either refers to Israel working and keeping the law, or referred to the priest role. Adam was a priest in the first sanctuary of God. He was to work and keep the sanctuary of God. That was his job. Where man and God met, where God manifested Himself to human beings in this garden sanctuary, Adam was supposed to work it and keep it. He was to fulfill the role of what a priest would do. Now, we usually don't use priestly language to describe Adam, but that's exactly what he was. But in Genesis 1:8, Adam is given a commission. Here's the commission. It says, God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. Adam and Eve were never supposed to stay in the Garden of Eden. They were supposed to have kids, and those kids were supposed to fill the entire earth. We don't usually think about that. We usually think, no, Adam and Eve, they were going to have kids, and everybody would just stay in the Garden of Eden. No, that's not what God commanded. He blessed them. Have children, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and have dominion and subdue everything on the earth. Everything. Adam and Eve were never going to stay in the garden, but they were to take the image of God and the presence of God through that image over the entire earth. Meredith Klein, and he is a professor at Westminster Seminary, argues that Adam and Eve were to extend the geographical boundaries of Eden until it covered the earth. You know what their job was? You know what their commission was? You take what Eden is, and you take it all over the world. Adam subdued everything, right? I mean, the animals came to him, and he named them. Dominion and rule. And God said, have children that bear your image, which bears my image, and fill the earth with my presence. Fill the entire... Take the geographical boundary of Eden and spread Eden all over the world. So it's right to say this. They were to take the first sanctuary or tabernacle, the first temple, and they were to fill the earth with it. However, did Adam do that? He didn't even subdue the garden properly, because that lying, thieving, murderous snake came in, and Adam did not do his job. It's interesting because God gave this exact same commission to the nation of Israel. God says, here's the temple. I'm going to meet with you, Adam. Adam, take my presence all over the world. Then, it fails. God then comes and makes a corporate Adam, the nation of Israel, and tells them to do the exact same thing. Tells Israel, and by the way, Israel's promised land is emphatically compared to the Garden of Eden in Genesis 13:10, Isaiah 53:3, Ezekiel 36:47 and 47:12, and Joel chapter 2, verse 3. In all of those passages, the promised land is explicitly compared to the Garden of Eden. Why? Because the promised land is the corporate Adam's Garden of Eden. Adam, the real Adam, the first Adam, had a Garden of Eden, which was where they were supposed to take that, spread it all over the world. Now, corporate Adam, Israel, they had their promised land, they had their Garden of Eden, and they were supposed to do the same thing. Where did the presence of God dwell in Israel? In the temple, the tabernacle, the tent of meeting. This is where it dwelled. Originally the tabernacle and ultimately the temple. Israel is called, notice this, Israel is called a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Now wait a minute. How can all of Israel be a kingdom of priests? Because they were supposed to do exactly what Adam was supposed to do. They were supposed to keep and work God's presence, God's law, God obeying the Lord. They were supposed to do the very same thing with the presence of God that Adam was supposed to do with the presence of God. The very same thing. They were to be mediators in spreading the light of God's presence in the rest of the dark world. In fact, the temple was a huge symbol of creation, representing the desire of God to fill the earth with His presence through His people. I'm going to go through this real quick. In the tabernacle or the temple, there were three sections. You had the outer section, you had the holy place, and the Holy of Holies. We usually don't have any problem talking about the Holy of Holies representing where God is. Right? We know that. We don't have any problem saying, well, the Holy of Holies, we already know that there's a Holy of Holies not made by human hands, so this one was a picture of the real Holy of Holies, which is where God is. We don't have a problem with that. And we're exactly right to believe that. However, there was two other sections to the temple that were also symbolic of things. The holy place. The holy place was symbolic of the skies, the visible skies. When you walked into the holy, by the way, I have a whole list of symbolic things. I'm just going to give you a few. When a priest would walk in to the holy place, there was zero light in it. No light whatsoever. You had deep, dark blue to purplish curtains that made the holy place. And when you walked in, there was no lights except a candlestick with 7 lamps on it. 7 candles on it. On the backdrop of blue. And we know, not only from the hints we get from Scripture, but we also have all the commentaries and writing of the Jewish people to know what they believed about the holy place. And you know what they believed about the holy place? They believed that those 7 lights represented the 7 visible light sources in the sky. Sun, moon, and 5 planets. So when you walked into the holy place, up against the backdrop of a dark blue sky, you had 7 visible light sources. There's a bunch more. For the sake of time, we'll stop. Then you had the outer court. Everything. Oh, by the way, the priest, the people that who could go into the Holy of Holies?
Only the high priest.
Only the high priest. How many times?
Once
a year. After a big. Why? Because you don't just walk in the presence of God. Who could go into the holy place? Could anybody just walk in there anytime they wanted to? No, only the priest. And it was a daily thing. They were constantly in there, but only the priest got to do that. Then you come to the outer court. And in the outer court, everything in the outer court was all about earth and sea. Everything. In fact, it represented the habitable world where humanity dwelt. Its description was represented as earthly, from the molten washing basin called the sea, literally called the sea, and the altar called the bosom of the earth, or the altar of the earth. Everything in the outer court was representing that which was earthly, and even further still, all Israel was allowed in it. Anybody could come into the outer court. Why? Because you're of earth. But not anybody can come into the holy place. And only one person can go in the Holy of Holies once a year. So the 3 segments of the sanctuary, and ultimately the temple, represented the 3 segments of the cosmos. Where God is, the heavens we can see, and the earth and sea. The earth. Why? Because the temple was a representation of the fact that God's presence was supposed to be spread throughout everything. Adam and Eve did not do it. Adam failed. God now gives the same command to Israel. You take my presence into the entire world. You take it into all the dark world. You take the name of Yahweh. The tabernacle was repeatedly referred to as the tabernacle of testimony. Israel was to accept God's testimony and then bear witness to God's saving presence with her in the present and the past. And then they were to declare their own testimony by obedience to the law. They were to obey the law and bear testimony of the presence of God. God's presence was to be spread from the Holy of Holies as Israel obeyed and testified to God's truth. What were they supposed to do? They were supposed to be a testimony to Yahweh's presence and glory and faithfulness and truth all over the entire world. That's what Israel's commission was. God did not intend for Israel to keep the presence of God to themselves, but to take it to the world. But like Adam, they failed in fulfilling their commission. And like Adam, Israel was cast away from the presence of God and kicked out of their land. Sent into Babylonian exile. Adam kicked out of his land. Israel now fails the commission, kicked out of their land. So Adam was given a commission, failed. Israel is given the same exact commission. Now, is it to be done a different way? Yes. But is it the same commission? Yes. And they failed. And then one night, in a small town where almost no one would think to look, the last Adam, the true Israel, and the ultimate temple was born, full of the glory of God. The New Testament portrays Jesus as a temple. But in what sense? In what sense is Jesus a temple? How is the description of the Old Testament background of the temple as symbolic of all of creation and the Garden of Eden symbolic of creation? How does this work with Jesus being called a temple? Well, the answer is that the New Testament refers to Christ as a temple because he was the beginning of a brand new creation. Everything Jesus did pointed to this new creation that he himself brings and that he himself begins. His genealogies, his resisting of the devil in the wilderness, his healings, raising of the dead, the forgiveness of sin, and ultimately his own resurrection. All of this was establishing a new creation. Jesus was doing what Adam and Israel failed to do. He was taking the presence of God and taking dominion over the world. Adam, given a commission, take the presence of God all over the world. Failed. Israel, given a commission, take the glory and the presence of God all over the world. Failed. And Jesus says, I'll do it. I'm the one to do this. I'm the one to do this. Jesus is the temple because he is the beginning of this new creation. By the way, church, guess what we're called? We're called the temple of God. In what sense are we the temple of God? We're the new creation taking the presence and glory of God all over the world. Right. We are doing what Adam failed to do. We are doing, as Christ as our head, what Israel failed to do. We're doing it. Matthew chapter 28, the Great Commission is given. What's the Great Commission? Jesus says, all authority is given to me. So go into all the world, baptize, making disciples of men, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Guess what? The commission to the disciples and to us is no different than the commission to Adam and Israel, but we do it through a different means. Adam was supposed to do it one way, he failed. Israel's supposed to do it one way, they failed. Jesus now comes and says, here's how we're going to do it, church, through the gospel. We are going to take the presence of God all over the world through the gospel. That's how we're going to do it. So we're a temple. So if Jesus and subsequently his church are the true temple accomplishing the commission given to human beings, we are replacing the old temple Jesus replaces the old temple. What must happen to the old temple? It's got to fall. Eden fell. Israel now, through their temple, has to fall. It has to fall. It's got to crumble. It has to be brought down. Jesus' teaching makes this clear. When we come to Matthew 24, this is not the beginning of a brand new section. This is the end of a section that starts in Matthew chapter 21. In Matthew chapter 21, Jesus goes and he runs the money changers out of the temple. You remember that? He goes in and he runs the money changers out of the temple. Now, you know what we usually call this, right? And the reason why we call it this is because somewhere in one of our Bibles we have a tag, like we have a little title section before, and it's called Jesus Cleanses the Temple. Jesus was not cleansing the temple. He was passing judgment upon the temple. He goes in there and he declares, as he's flipping over tables and he's whipping animals and money's going everywhere and all this chaos is happening. All of this is going on, and Jesus then declares this when he quotes Isaiah 56, 3 through 8, when he says, this is supposed to be a house of prayer, you've made it a den of thieves. And in Isaiah 56, 3 through 8, we are told that Gentiles would worship in the future temple. Jesus is not cleansing the temple. He's passing judgment on the temple. This temple was supposed to be a house of prayer. And what are you doing? You're making it a den of thieves. And he quotes Isaiah, where in the context, Isaiah is saying that one day Gentiles will worship in the true temple. How's that possible? It's what we are. Are we not worshiping in the true temple? We are fulfillment of Isaiah chapter 56, verse 3 through 8. Directly after this, those who are forbidden in the temple. Do you know there were Israelites who were forbidden to come in the temple? You know who they were? Any kind of deformity or sickness or illness, you could not come into the temple. They wouldn't let you in. Jesus causes this big ruckus in the temple. And guess who comes into the temple? The lame, the sick. If you look at Matthew 21, it says, and the blind and the lame came to him in the temple and he healed them. Whoa, 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 whoa. What's he saying by that? He's saying, hey, this new temple, this new creation, guess what happens? The lame and the beggars and the sick get to come and get healed and worship. This old temple, you're keeping them out. The new temple brings them in. The Old Testament had prophesied that eunuchs and outcasts would one day worship in a future sanctuary with the Gentiles. Immediately after cleansing and healing people in the temple, Jesus acts out a parable that provides further proof that he was replacing the old temple. And in 21:19, Jesus sees a fig tree. And the fig tree doesn't have any fruit on it. Has no fruit. And Jesus says this. He curses the fig tree and he says, may no fruit ever come from you again. And at once the fig tree withers. The fig tree, without fruit, represented Israel and their temple and the spiritual fruitlessness of their condition. N.T. Wright points out that when Jesus states in verse 21 of chapter 21, when he says this, and Jesus answered, truly I say to you, if you have faith and do not doubt, you will not only do what has been done to this fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, it will happen. N.T. Wright says the only possible explanation to what this mountain represented was the Temple Mount. In other words, the Temple Mount is going to be picked up and thrown into the sea, symbolic of it's going to get destroyed. Then in 21:33, Jesus tells a parable of a vineyard. A landowner plants a vineyard, rents it out to some vine growers. But when the time comes for them to come and collect rent, the vine growers mistreat the landlord's son. Symbolic. They mistreat the landlord's son. Jesus concludes by saying that the landowner will bring the wretched to a wretched end and give the vineyard to other vine growers who will pay the proceeds at the proper time. Then Jesus alludes to Isaiah 5, 1 through 6, which compares Israel to a vineyard, which he would tear down because of its unfaithfulness. Most of the sects of Judaism recognize the vineyard as the temple, including the early Aramaic Bible of early Judaism called the Targum. So the earliest Bible they had, the Aramaic Bible, says the vineyard in Isaiah 51 is the temple. And Jesus says, I'm going to tear the vineyard down, the temple down, and I'm going to give it to somebody else. Who's the somebody else? Jesus solidifies this view in verse 42 when he says, the stone the builders rejected has now become the cornerstone. Who's the cornerstone? The cornerstone of what? Of a new temple. A new creation. A brand new temple. And Paul and Peter pick up the language of Jesus and they elaborate on it and say, and we are being shaped and built. A holy house is being built with Jesus being the cornerstone. Why? We are the new temple, the new creation, taking the presence of God all over the world. The Old Testament temple represented the presence of God on the earth. And now Jesus represents the presence in the midst of his followers. And Jesus makes it abundantly clear in Matthew 24 that Israel's temple will be destroyed. Nevertheless, another temple would arise. Instead, it will be in the form of Jesus and his followers. There's much more to say on this, but I'll leave it at that. But now we are able to answer the question, why must the temple fall? Why must Israel's temple fall? Because it was a symbol of the old creation that had failed to do what it had been commanded to do. And now it was nothing more than a superstitious object that was being elevated to idolatry. And it has to come down. What did Jesus command Israel to do? Every time they went into a place where idol altars were elevated on mountains, what did he tell them to do? Tear them down. And now we have this idolatrous temple standing. And people are saying, it's the presence of God's in there. This is where we worship. This is how we worship. And Jesus says, no, it's idolatry. If you were here before we become what we worship, you know we went into Stephen's message where Stephen elaborates on the fact that the temple was an idol. And they killed Stephen for saying that. The true new creation temple had arrived, and the old creation temple was going to be destroyed as a sign that Jesus and his followers are the eschatological temple, the end-time temple prophesied in the Old Testament. When you saw the language of a temple being forever, you saw the language of the former glory, the latter glory being greater than the former glory. It wasn't the second rebuilt temple. It was Jesus and his church. Yeah. That's the fulfillment of these Old Testament things that the Jewish people thought, second temple. Jesus is now correcting the disciples in Matthew 24. And he's saying, no. It's not the second temple. You got it wrong. So I'm going to have to split your question up into two different answers. Two questions. We'll deal with the temple falling first. And it's not the end of the world. The temple falling is not the end of the world. When the temple falls, a new temple has arisen. And let me ask you a question. Will the new temple and the new creation with the last Adam and the true Israel as its head, will it fail in its commission? Absolutely not. It cannot. Finally, the commission given to Adam and given to Israel will be fulfilled in Christ and his church. Yeah. And the entire world will be filled with the glory of God. And guess what we have in Revelation, at the end of Revelation? Jesus comes down. The New Jerusalem comes down, and the entire earth is filled with the presence of God. Church, there is no temple that Israel must build in order for the end times to come. There is no temple that we must wait on being built in order for Jesus to come back. Any temple that Israel erects, and they might very well build another temple is nothing more than pagan idolatry. Why? Because there's a temple that has replaced it. And the idea that Israel's going to build a temple and the presence of God is going to come and dwell once again in a building, a temple, and by the way, that's what the tradition is that most of us grew up on. Yeah. That Israel as a nation gets reestablished, and then they're going to rebuild their temple, and that's this sign that Jesus is coming back. And when Jesus comes back, that glory of God is going to refill the temple for 1,000 years in a millennium period. Nothing more than idolatry. How can God be pleased with a temple being built and people thinking there's the presence of God when Jesus and his church is the fulfillment of all the Old Testament prophecies? So, from Matthew 24, 4 through 35, Jesus is telling the disciples when this destruction of the temple would take place and what are the signs to look for to know that it's coming.